They said the universe was a neighborhood, and Earth was never invited to the block party. But here is the thing nobody expected. When the door finally opened and then slammed shut in humanity's face, humans did not cry. They did not beg. They did not wage war. They smiled. They turned around, and they built something so extraordinary that the entire galaxy would one day stand outside their door, knocking, waiting, hoping to be let in. This is that story, and it does not end the way you think it will. The signal arrived on a Tuesday. It was not dramatic. There was no giant ship hovering over a city, no beam of light cutting through clouds, no aliens standing on the White House lawn. It was just a signal, a clean, mathematical pulse buried inside the background radiation of space, repeating every 47 seconds with a precision that no natural phenomenon could produce. A graduate student named Priya Sharma at the Indian Institute of Astrophysics in Bangalore was the first to notice it. She had been running routine scans on data from the James Webb Telescope when her screen flickered with a pattern that made her coffee go cold in her hand. She called her supervisor. Her supervisor called the department head. The department head called the government. Within 6 hours, the signal had been confirmed by 12 observatories across 6 continents. Within 12 hours, the Secretary General of the United Nations was standing at a podium in New York, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke words that would change human history forever. We are not alone. Social media exploded. Stock markets froze. Churches filled. Bars filled faster. People stood in the streets looking up at the sky as if expecting to see something, anything, that would confirm what they already knew in their bones. Humanity had spent thousands of years asking the question, now. In the space of a single afternoon, the answer had arrived. The signal contained instructions, not complicated ones. A frequency, a time, a set of coordinates pointing to a location just beyond the orbit of Saturn. It was an invitation, or at least that is what everyone assumed it was. The world's governments moved faster than they had ever moved on anything. Old rivalries were set aside. Budgets were rewritten overnight. NASA, ESA, ISRO, CNESA, Roscosmos, agencies that had spent decades competing with each other suddenly found themselves sitting at the same table, sharing data, sharing resources, sharing a single goal. A ship was built. Not a warship, not an exploration vessel, a diplomatic vessel. Humanity's first ambassador to the stars was not a politician or a general. It was a linguist named Dr. Elena Vasquez, a woman who spoke 11 Earth languages and who had spent her career studying how beings communicate across barriers of culture and cognition. She was joined by a crew of 47 scientists, engineers, doctors, a philosopher, a poet, even a chef, because someone on the planning committee had argued that if humanity was going to meet its galactic neighbors, it should at least be well fed when it did so. The ship was called the Outstretched Hand. It launched from French Guiana on a morning when the sky was so clear that the contrail could be seen for hundreds of miles. Billions watched. Children pointed at the sky. Old men cried. The outstretched hand climbed through the atmosphere and turned towards Saturn, carrying with it the collective hope of 8 billion people. The journey took 11 days. 11 days of silence from the crew. 11 days of the world waiting. 11 days of arguments on television and prayers in temples and debates in coffee shops about what the aliens would look like, what they would say, what they would want. On the 12th day, the outstretched hand reached the coordinates. And they were already there. The alien vessel was enormous. Not in the way a building is enormous or a mountain is enormous. It was enormous in a way that broke something in the human brain. It stretched across the darkness like a second moon, its surface smooth and silver, covered in patterns that shifted and moved like liquid mercury. There were no windows, no visible engines, no markings of any kind. It simply existed, vast and silent, as if it had always been there, and the universe had simply been built around it. Dr. Vasquez stood at the observation window and stared. Behind her, the crew was silent. The philosopher was muttering something under his breath. The poet was writing. The chef was gripping the edge of a counter with white knuckles. "Open a channel," Vasquez said. The communication officer did. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then a voice came through the speakers. It was not a voice exactly. It was more like a vibration that arranged itself into words, as if the air itself was learning how to speak English in real time. "You are the beings from the third planet." "Yes," Vasquez said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. We are humans. From Earth. We received your signal and we came. We know what you are, the voice said. We have been observing your planet for some time. You are young. Very young. Your species has existed for a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the time the galaxy has been alive. You have only recently learned to leave your own atmosphere. You still fight among yourselves over resources, over beliefs, over lines drawn on maps. You are, by the standards of the galactic community, primitive. The word landed like a stone in a still pond. Vasquez felt it ripple through the crew behind her. She saw the communication officer's jaw tighten. She saw the philosopher close his eyes. She felt her own pride rise in her chest like heat. But she was a diplomat. She swallowed it down. We know we are young, she said. That is why we came. To learn, to grow, to join the community you speak of. There was a pause. When the voice spoke again, it carried something that Vasquez could only describe as pity. That is not why we called you here, the voice explained. Slowly, carefully, the way an adult explains something difficult to a child. The galaxy, it said, was organized. It had been organized for longer than Earth's sun had existed. There were over 4,000 spacefaring civilizations spread across every arm of the Milky Way. They were governed by a body called the Concord of Aligned Species. The Concord maintained peace. It regulated trade. It managed resources. It settled disputes. It had rules. And those rules had kept the galaxy stable for millions of years. Earth, the voice said, had been noticed. Humanity's radio signals had been leaking into space for over a century, and those signals had been picked up, analyzed, and discussed. Humanity's nuclear tests had been detected. Humanity's satellites had been catalogued. Humanity's wars had been watched with a mixture of curiosity and concern. And a decision had been made. The Concord has reviewed the evidence, the voice said. Your species is unstable. You are aggressive. You are divided. You consume resources at an unsustainable rate. You have developed weapons capable of destroying your own planet, and you have come close to using them on multiple occasions. The Concord has concluded that integrating your species into the galactic community at this time would represent an unacceptable risk. Vasquez felt the words like a physical blow. She opened her mouth, but the voice continued. You are hereby excluded from the Concord of Aligned Species. You are forbidden from traveling beyond the boundary of your own solar system. Any attempt to cross this boundary will be met with immediate and decisive action. Your solar system will be enclosed within a containment field that will prevent any vessel or signal from passing through. You will remain within this field until such time as the Concord determines that your species has evolved sufficiently to warrant reconsideration. The silence that followed was absolute. Vasquez stared at the observation window, at the vast silver ship that hung in the darkness like a judgment. Behind her, someone let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for a lifetime. How long? Vasquez asked. Her voice was quiet now, almost a whisper. The average review cycle is 10,000 years. 10,000 years. The number hung in the air. 10,000 years of isolation. 10,000 years locked inside their own solar system while the rest of the galaxy moved on without them. 10,000 years of being told they were not good enough. Vasquez closed her eyes. She thought about the billions of people back on Earth who were watching, listening, hoping. She thought about the children who had pointed at the sky. She thought about the old men who had cried. She thought about every human being who had ever looked up at the stars and wondered if someone was looking back. Someone had been looking back. And they had decided that humanity was not worth the trouble. She opened her eyes. Is there anything we can do, she asked. Any test we can pass? Any criteria we can meet? The criteria are not disclosed to excluded species, the voice said. Disclosure has been shown to produce artificial behavioral modification rather than genuine evolution. You must become what you need to become on your own, or not at all. Vasquez nodded slowly. She looked at her crew. She saw anger in some faces, despair in others, shame, confusion, fear. She saw the full range of human emotion laid out before her like a map of everything they were. And then something happened that the voice behind the silver ship did not expect. Vasquez smiled. It was not a bitter smile. It was not a sarcastic smile. It was not the smile of someone pretending to be brave. It was the smile of someone who had just been told the mountain was impossible to climb and had decided to climb it anyway, not to prove anything to anyone, but because that is what humans do. "Thank you," she said, "for telling us the truth, for not pretending." The voice paused. In all its centuries of delivering exclusion notices to young species, it had never received thanks. "You accept the decision?" "We accept that it has been made," Vasquez said. "We do not accept that it is permanent." She turned to her crew. She straightened her back. She spoke clearly, knowing that every word was being transmitted back to Earth, knowing that 8 billion people were listening. "We are going home," she said, "and we are going to get to work." The outstretched hand turned away from the silver ship. It fired its engines and began the long journey back to Earth. Behind it, the containment field activated. A shimmer passed through the space around the solar system, invisible to the eye but absolute in its purpose. The door to the galaxy closed. And on every screen, on every device, in every language, the people of Earth heard Elena Vasquez say the words that would define the next chapter of human history. "They told us we are not ready. Maybe they are right. But being told you cannot do something has never stopped us before. We walked out of caves. We crossed oceans. We split the atom. We left our own planet. Every single time someone or something told humanity that it could not, we did. This will be no different. We do not need their permission to become extraordinary. We never did." The world erupted, not in anger, not in despair, in something far more dangerous to the established order of the galaxy, in determination. Within 24 hours of the outstretched hand's return, the United Nations convened an emergency session. Every nation on Earth sent its representative. The session lasted 14 hours. There were arguments. There were tears. There were moments of silence so deep that the translators had nothing to translate. But when the session ended, something unprecedented had happened. Every nation on Earth, without exception, signed a single document. It was called the Earth Compact, and it said, in simple language that left no room for misunderstanding, that from this day forward, the people of Earth would work together, not as nations, not as races, not as religions or ideologies, as one species, one people, one purpose. The purpose was not revenge. It was not conquest. It was not to prove the Concord wrong. The purpose was to become what they were always capable of becoming. The first decade was the hardest. Old habits die hard, and humanity had a lot of old habits. Orders did not disappear overnight. Prejudices did not evaporate. Economies did not merge without friction. There were setbacks. There were failures. There were moments when it seemed like the whole thing would collapse under the weight of human stubbornness and human pride. But something had changed. Something fundamental. For the first time in its history, humanity had a shared experience. Every human being alive had heard the same words. "You are not good enough. You are not ready. You are excluded." And every human being alive had felt the same thing in response. A burning, quiet, unshakable refusal to accept that judgment as final. Scientists who had spent careers competing for funding suddenly found themselves collaborating across borders. Engineers who had built weapons began building infrastructure. Teachers rewrote curricula to emphasize cooperation, critical thinking, and empathy. Artists created works that spoke to the shared human experience of rejection and resilience. Philosophers debated not what divided humanity, but what united it. The containment field around the solar system became a symbol, not a prison wall, but a challenge. A dare, a line in the sand that the universe had drawn and that humanity intended to erase. Not by force, not by trickery, by becoming something better. And slowly, year by year, generation by generation, they did. Nobody knew exactly when the shift happened. There was no single moment, no dramatic turning point. It was more like a tide, gradual, relentless, unstoppable. Wars became rarer, then rare, then almost unheard of. Poverty shrank. Education expanded. Technology advanced not for profit or power, but for the collective good. The air became cleaner. The oceans healed. The forests returned. And through it all, humanity kept looking up at the stars. Not with longing, not with resentment, with patience. With quiet confidence. with the calm certainty of a species that had been told it was not good enough and had decided, without drama or fanfare, to prove otherwise. They did not know if the Concorde was watching. They did not care. They were not doing this for the Concorde. They were doing this for themselves. And they smiled, because they knew something that the 4,000 civilizations of the Concorde did not. Being underestimated is the most dangerous thing that can happen to a human being. Not because it makes them angry, but because it makes them creative. It makes them stubborn. It makes them work harder and dream bigger and push further than anyone thought possible. The galaxy had excluded Earth, and Earth had just gotten started. 100 years passed inside the containment field, and the galaxy forgot about Earth the way a city forgets about a locked room in an abandoned building. Out of sight, out of mind. A footnote in the Concorde's records. Species number 4012. Status: excluded. Threat level: negligible. Review date: approximately 9,900 years remaining. But inside that locked room, something extraordinary was happening. The generation that had heard Elena Vasquez's words was gone now. Their children were gone too. But the fire they had lit was not. It had been passed down like a living thing, carried in stories and songs and lessons, and the quiet way parents looked at the night sky and told their children that the stars were not a ceiling, they were a promise. The Earth of the 22nd century would have been unrecognizable to the people who had wept when the containment field went up. The planet had healed, not partially, not in patches, completely. The oceans were clear. The forests were vast and dense and alive with species that had been on the edge of extinction a century before. The air was clean in a way that humans had not experienced since before the Industrial Revolution. Cities still existed, but they had changed. They were woven into the landscape rather than carved out of it. Buildings grew alongside trees. Rivers ran through streets. Gardens covered rooftops. The boundary between civilization and nature had dissolved, not because humans had retreated from technology, but because they had advanced beyond the point where technology and nature needed to be enemies. Energy was no longer a problem. Fusion reactors powered everything, clean and quiet and inexhaustible. Scarcity, the ancient engine of human conflict, had been dismantled piece by piece. Food was abundant, water was clean, shelter was universal. Healthcare had advanced to the point where most diseases were historical curiosities studied in classrooms by children who could not quite believe that people had once died from infections or organ failure. But the real transformation was not physical. It was mental, cultural, spiritual, in a way that had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with the human capacity for growth. The old divisions had not been erased by force or by decree. They had been outgrown. Languages still existed, hundreds of them preserved and celebrated as expressions of human creativity. Cultures still flourished, each one a unique thread in the tapestry. But the idea that any of these differences were reasons for conflict had become as alien to the humans of the 22nd century as the idea that the Earth was flat had become to the humans of the 21st. People still disagreed. They argued passionately about art, about philosophy, about the best way to raise children, and the best way to cook rice, and whether the new fusion reactor design was elegant or merely functional. But they argued the way family members argue, knowing that at the end of the day, they were still family. Education had become the cornerstone of everything. Every child on Earth had access to the best teachers, the best tools, the best resources, and the curriculum had changed. Science was still taught, rigorously and thoroughly, but alongside it, children learned empathy. They learned how to listen. They learned how to disagree without destroying. They learned history, not as a list of dates and battles, but as a story of mistakes and lessons and the slow, painful, beautiful process of becoming better. And they learned about the Concorde. Every child on Earth knew the story, how the signal had come, how the outstretched hand had flown to Saturn and been told that humanity was not welcome, how Elena Vasquez had smiled and said thank you and brought her people home. The story was not told as a tale of injustice or victimhood. It was told as a beginning, the moment humanity stopped waiting for permission and started building its own future. Dr. Vasquez herself had lived to be 93. She had spent her final decades not as a diplomat but as a teacher, traveling the world and talking to young people about what she had seen and heard beyond Saturn. She never expressed bitterness toward the Concorde. When asked if she resented them, she would shake her head and say, "They told us the truth about ourselves. It hurt, But the truth always hurts before it heals. Her words were carved into the wall of the Global Academy in Geneva, where the best minds of each generation gathered to push the boundaries of human knowledge. And push they did. Without access to the stars, humanity turned its attention inward, to the solar system, to the vast untapped resources that floated in the darkness between planets. Mining operations spread across the asteroid belt. Colonies grew on Mars, not the fragile outposts of early ambition, but thriving cities with their own cultures and traditions, connected to Earth by a network of transport lanes that made the journey routine. Jupiter's moons became laboratories. Saturn's rings became construction yards. Even the cold, distant reaches of the outer system felt the touch of human hands. The engineering challenges were immense. Every problem humanity had ever faced in space was magnified 100 times when the scale expanded. Radiation, distance, temperature extremes, the psychological toll of living far from the sun. But humans solved problems the way they always had, by refusing to accept that the problems were unsolvable. New materials were developed. Alloys that could withstand temperatures that would melt anything previously known. Composites that were lighter than air and stronger than steel. Metamaterials that could bend light and redirect energy in ways that the physicists of the 21st century would have called magic. New propulsion systems were designed. Not the chemical rockets of the old era, not even the nuclear engines that had carried the first colonists to Mars. Something new. Something that used the fabric of space itself as a medium, folding it gently, surfing the wrinkles. Ships could cross the solar system in days rather than months, and with each improvement, the journeys became shorter. Days became hours, hours became minutes. But always, always, the containment field stood at the edge, a wall of invisible energy that no ship could pass, no signal could penetrate, no force could break. Humanity tested it, gently at first, then with increasing sophistication. They sent probes. They fired beams. They tried to tunnel under it, around it, through it. Nothing worked. The Concorde's technology was millions of years ahead. The field was absolute. Some people despaired at this. Some argued that humanity should focus on what it had and stop beating its head against a wall that would never break. But they were a minority, and their arguments never gained much traction, because humanity had learned something about itself in the centuries since the exclusion. It had learned that the wall was not the point. The trying was the point. The growing was the point. The becoming was the point. And so they kept pushing. The breakthrough came not from an engineer or a physicist, but from a biologist named Kofi Asante, who worked in a small laboratory on Titan, Saturn's largest moon. Kofi was studying the way certain extremophile organisms adapted to environments that should have killed them, not just survived in those environments. Thrived. He was fascinated by the way life found a way. Always. No matter how hostile the conditions, no matter how impossible the odds, life found a way. He was looking at the molecular structure of a bacterium that had been discovered in the ice vents of Enceladus when he noticed something strange. The bacterium was not just surviving in the extreme cold and pressure, it was interacting with the quantum field around it, not in a way that any biological organism had ever been observed to do. It was manipulating quantum states at the molecular level, effectively rewriting the rules of its own environment to make survival possible. Kofi stared at his data for 3 days. He checked it, he rechecked it. He had his colleagues check it. The results were the same every time. Life was not just a product of physics. Life could change physics. The implications took years to unpack. Decades. A new field of science emerged, one that sat at the intersection of biology, quantum mechanics, and something that did not have a name yet because it had never existed before. Researchers across the solar system dove into the work with a fervor that bordered on obsession. If biological systems could interact with quantum fields, then perhaps human consciousness, the most complex biological system known, could do the same. The research branched in 100 directions. Some teams studied meditation and the effects of focused consciousness on quantum states. Others built machines that could amplify biological quantum interactions. Others looked at the containment field itself, analyzing its structure with new eyes, searching for the biological key that might unlock a technological door. And while the scientists worked, the rest of humanity continued to build. The solar system became a garden, not a metaphorical garden, a literal one. Terraforming technology, refined over decades, transformed Mars from a red desert into a world of green valleys and blue lakes. The process took generations, but humans were patient now. They thought in centuries rather than quarters. Venus was next. Its crushing atmosphere slowly converted into something breathable by swarms of engineered microorganisms that ate carbon dioxide and exhaled oxygen. Even the moons of the outer planets were touched, their icy surfaces warmed by orbital mirrors, their barren landscapes seeded with life. Humanity spread. Not in the chaotic, competitive way of the old days, methodically, carefully. Each new settlement was planned not just for survival, but for beauty, because humans had learned that beauty was not a luxury. It was a necessity. A species that surrounded itself with ugliness became ugly. A species that built with care and love and attention became something worth caring about and loving. Art flourished in ways that would have seemed impossible to the Earth of the 21st century. With basic needs met and education universal, human creativity exploded. Music that incorporated the sounds of other worlds, the singing of Martian winds, the deep vibrations of Jupiter's magnetosphere, painting that used pigments derived from asteroids, colors that had never existed on Earth, literature that explored the human condition with a depth and honesty that earlier generations could only have dreamed of. And always, underneath everything, the quiet question remained, were they ready yet? Had they become what the Concorde said they needed to become? Nobody knew. The criteria had never been disclosed. But humanity had stopped asking. Not because they had given up, because they had realized that the question itself was a trap. If they changed themselves to meet someone else's standards, they would not be genuinely changed. They would be performing. And the Concorde had specifically warned against that. You must become what you need to become on your own, or not at all. So they became what they needed to become, not for the Concorde, for themselves. For each other. For the children who would inherit whatever they built. 200 years after the exclusion, a woman named Lin May sat in a garden on Titan, watching methane rain fall on the transparent dome above her. She was old, nearly 140, which was not unusual for her generation. Medical science had extended the human lifespan significantly, though not indefinitely. People still aged, still died. They had simply been given more time, and they used it well. Lin May had spent her career studying the containment field, not trying to break it, just understanding it. And over the decades, she had come to a conclusion that she had shared with only a few trusted colleagues because it sounded insane. The containment field was alive, not in the way a person or an animal was alive, but in the way a forest was alive. It was a system, a network of interacting components that responded to stimuli, adapted to conditions, and maintained itself with a sophistication that went far beyond any technology humanity had ever encountered. It was not a wall. It was a membrane. And like all membranes, it had conditions under which it would allow things to pass through. Lin May believed that the conditions were not technological. They were not about what humanity could build. They were about what humanity was. The field was reading them, constantly, evaluating the sum total of human civilization, the wars, the peace, the art, the science, the kindness, the cruelty, all of it, and rendering a judgment in real time. If she was right, then the containment field was the test. Not a barrier to keep humanity in, a mirror to show humanity what it was. And it would only open when the reflection was right. She shared her theory with the Global Council, the governing body that had replaced the United Nations a century earlier. The Council listened, they debated, they asked questions, and then they did something remarkable. They decided it did not matter. If the field opens, it opens, said the Council speaker, a man named Thomas who had been born on Mars and had never set foot on Earth. If it does not, it does not. We did not become who we are for the sake of a door. We became who we are for the sake of becoming. If we spend another 10,000 years inside this solar system, we will spend them well. That is enough. The statement was broadcast across every settlement in the solar system, and the response was not disappointment. It was not resignation. It was agreement. Quiet, confident, unanimous agreement. Humanity had stopped needing the galaxy's approval, and that, though nobody knew it yet, was the point. 300 years after the exclusion, on an ordinary morning on an ordinary day, a ship was making a routine supply run between Jupiter and the asteroid belt when its navigator noticed something strange on her instruments, a fluctuation, a shimmer, a brief, almost imperceptible softening in the containment field. like a held breath being released. She reported it. Within hours, observatories across the solar system confirmed it. The containment field was changing. Not dramatically, not in a way that suggested failure or collapse, but changing, softening, thinning, as if something on the other side was adjusting it, or as if something on the inside had finally passed the test. The news spread across the solar system at the speed of light. People stopped what they were doing and looked up, looked out, looked toward the edge of everything they had ever known. Families gathered, friends held hands, strangers smiled at strangers, and they waited, not with anxiety, not with desperation, not with the frantic energy of a species that had been trapped for 3 centuries and could finally see the door opening. They waited with grace, with patience, with the calm, steady confidence of a people who had spent 300 years proving, not to the galaxy but to themselves, that they were worth something, that they were capable of greatness, that the universe's rejection had not defined them. Their response to it had. On Earth, in the garden outside the Global Academy in Geneva, a young girl sat beneath a tree and read the words carved into the wall. The words Elena Vasquez had spoken 300 years ago when she came home from Saturn with the worst news humanity had ever received and turned it into the best thing that had ever happened to them. The girl read the words and smiled. The same smile. The same quiet, unbreakable human smile that had confused an alien intelligence 3 centuries ago and was about to confuse an entire galaxy. Something was coming. Something was changing. The field was thinning and the stars were getting closer, and the door that had been closed for 300 years was starting to open. But humanity was not standing at the door, not pressing against it, not hammering on it. Humanity was sitting in its garden, reading, learning, building, loving, ready for whatever came next, but not desperate for it. And somewhere, on the other side of the containment field, someone was watching. And for the first time, in a very long time, that someone was impressed. The containment field did not fall all at once. It thinned over the course of 7 days, like fog burning off a lake at dawn. Sensors tracked it in real time, mapping the slow dissolution of an energy barrier that had held humanity inside its own solar system for 312 years. On the first day, the field weakened by 4%. On the second, by another 7%. By the 5th day, probes sent to the boundary were passing through without resistance, their instruments recording nothing but empty space where an impenetrable wall had stood for centuries. On the 7th day, it was gone. The moment was quiet. There was no explosion, no shockwave, no dramatic collapse. The containment field simply ceased to exist, as if someone had turned off a light. One moment the boundary was there, the next it was not. The stars beyond the solar system, which had always been visible but never reachable, were suddenly just stars again. Distant, cold, real, and for the first time in 3 centuries, accessible. Across the solar system, people marked the moment in their own ways. On Earth, bells rang in cities. On Mars, settlers stood on red hills and looked upward through thin atmosphere at the band of the Milky Way. On Titan, researchers in their domed laboratories paused their work and held a minute of silence. On the 1,000 stations and outposts that dotted the asteroid belt, workers stepped away from their tasks and floated near windows, staring out at an infinity that had just gotten infinitely larger. But there was no rush to leave. That surprised the observers, though by now, perhaps it should not have. Humanity had spent 3 centuries locked inside its solar system, and in that time it had built something remarkable. A civilization that stretched from the sun to the outer reaches. A network of worlds and stations and habitats connected by bonds of shared purpose and mutual respect. The solar system was not a prison. It was a home. And humans do not abandon their homes just because a new door opens. The Global Council convened within hours. The discussion was calm, measured, thorough. There were no calls for immediate expansion, no demands to rush through the gap before it closed again. Instead, there were questions. Why had the field dropped? Was this a test, an invitation, a trap? And perhaps most importantly, what did humanity want to do with its newfound freedom? The answer came not from the Council itself, but from the billions of ordinary people who participated in the open deliberation that followed. It took 3 weeks. Every settlement in the solar system weighed in. Every voice was heard. And the consensus, when it emerged, was characteristically human. We will go. But we will go carefully. We will go with open hands and open minds. We will not repeat the mistakes of our past. We will not colonize. We will not conquer. We will explore. We will learn. We will offer what we have and accept what is offered. And if the galaxy does not want us, we will respect that and come home. The first ship to cross the old boundary line was not a warship or an exploration vessel. It was a science ship named the Patient Step, crewed by 50 researchers from 12 different worlds within the solar system. Its captain was a woman named Yuki Tanaka, born on Earth, raised on Mars, educated on Europa. She was 47 years old and had spent her entire career studying interstellar space from the inside of a cage. Now the cage was open, and she was the first one through. The Patient Step crossed the boundary at exactly noon, Earth Standard Time, on a date that would later be celebrated as Crossing Day. Its instruments recorded nothing unusual. No alarms, no energy signatures, no indication that the containment field had ever existed. The ship sailed into interstellar space as smoothly as a boat leaving a harbor, and behind it the solar system glittered like a jewel against the black. They traveled for 6 days before they encountered anything. It was a beacon. A small device, no larger than a human fist, floating in the void and broadcasting a signal on a frequency that humanity now recognized instantly, the same frequency the original signal had used 3 centuries ago. The beacon contained a message. Simple, direct, unmistakable. You are expected. Proceed to the following coordinates. The coordinates pointed to a star system approximately 40 light-years from Earth. With the propulsion technology humanity had developed during its centuries of confinement, the journey would take approximately 3 months. Yuki Tanaka studied the message. She consulted with her crew. She reported back to the Global Council, and then she set course for the coordinates because that is what the Patient Step had been built to do. The 3 months passed slowly. The crew kept busy with research, cataloguing the interstellar medium, measuring cosmic radiation, mapping gravitational anomalies. But beneath the routine there was an undercurrent of anticipation that no amount of professionalism could fully suppress. They were going to meet the galaxy. Or rather, the galaxy was going to meet them. The question was which version of the galaxy would be waiting. They arrived at the coordinates on a morning that existed only in the artificial day-night cycle of the ship. The star system was unremarkable. A yellow dwarf, slightly smaller than Earth's sun, orbited by 7 planets. But in the space between the 3rd and 4th planets, something waited. Ships, thousands of them. They filled the void like a floating city, each one different from the last. Some were vast and organic, their hulls covered in what looked like living tissue, pulsing with bioluminescent light. Others were geometric and precise, crystalline structures that caught the starlight and scattered it in rainbow patterns. Some were barely visible, dark shapes that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, revealing themselves only as silhouettes against the distant stars. A few defied geometry entirely, their shapes impossible, existing in dimensions that the human eye could not fully process. The concord of aligned species, all 4,000 of them, gathered in one place. Yuki Tanaka stood on the bridge of the Patient Step and looked out at the assembled fleet of an entire galaxy. She was aware that she was trembling. She was also aware that her crew was looking at her, waiting for her to say something, to do something, to be the voice and face of humanity in this moment. She opened a communication channel. "This is Captain Yuki Tanaka of the human vessel Patient Step. We received your signal. We are here." The response came immediately, not from one ship, from all of them. A harmonic vibration that resonated through the hull of the Patient Step, through the floor, through the bones of every human on board. It was a greeting. Not in words, in feeling. A wave of acknowledgement, of curiosity, of something that Yuki could only describe as respect. Then a single voice emerged from the harmony. It was different from the voice Elena Vasquez had heard 3 centuries ago. Warmer, more personal, but it carried the same precision, the same clarity. "Welcome, humans. The concord of aligned species has been watching. We have seen what you have done." Yuki swallowed. "What we have done with our imprisonment, you mean?" "With your opportunity," the voice corrected gently. "Every excluded species receives the same opportunity. The containment field is not a punishment. It is a crucible, a controlled environment in which a young species can grow without interference, without distraction, without the corrupting influence of advanced technology and alien culture that it is not ready to absorb. Yuki processed this. Around her, her crew was silent, listening. How many species have been excluded? She asked. In the history of the Concorde, 7,412 species have been placed under containment. How many have passed? There was a pause, a long pause, long enough that Yuki felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders like a physical thing. 23. Out of over 7,000 species, only 23 had passed the test. The rest had failed. Some had destroyed themselves, some had stagnated, some had descended into permanent internal conflict, some had simply given up, accepting the containment field as their reality and never pushing beyond it. A few had tried to break through by force and had been destroyed by the very technology designed to protect the galaxy from them. 23 out of 7,412, and humanity was the 24th. What made us different? Yuki asked. It was the question that every human who ever heard this story would ask. The question that would be debated in classrooms and coffee shops and council chambers for generations. What made us different? The voice answered without hesitation, as if it had been waiting for exactly this question. You were told you were not good enough. And instead of proving us wrong, you simply became better. Not for us, for yourselves. That is the difference. Every species that fails does so because it tries to meet our criteria. It performs. It changes its behavior to satisfy an external judge. But the change is superficial. When the pressure is removed, the species reverts to what it was. You did something no other excluded species has done in a very long time. You forgot about us. You stopped caring about our judgment. You turned inward and decided to become what you wanted to be, on your own terms, for your own reasons. And what you became was extraordinary. She thought about the centuries, the struggles, the slow, patient work of building a civilization worth having, the art and the science and the compassion and the 10,000 daily acts of ordinary kindness that had transformed a species of squabbling primates into something that could stand before the assembled might of an entire galaxy without flinching. We did not forget about you, she said quietly. We thought about you often. We just decided that you were not the point. Exactly, the voice said, and in that single word, Yuki heard something she had not expected. Admiration. The Concorde offered humanity membership that day. Full membership, unrestricted access to galactic trade routes, communication networks, shared scientific databases, cultural exchanges. Everything that had been denied 3 centuries ago was now laid at humanity's feet. But the terms were different from what anyone had expected. The Concorde did not simply hand humanity a seat at the table. It offered humanity a role. A specific, unique, unprecedented role that no other species in the history of the Concorde had ever been asked to fill. Mentor. The galaxy, it turned out, had a problem. The same problem it had always had. Young species were being discovered at an increasing rate, and the vast majority of them were failing the containment test. The Concorde's approach, exclusion, isolation, waiting, had a success rate of less than 0.5%. Thousands of species had been lost. Entire civilizations snuffed out not by external enemies but by their own inability to grow. And the Concorde did not know how to fix it, because the Concorde's member species, old and stable and wise as they were, had all passed their own tests so long ago that they had forgotten what it felt like to fail. They had forgotten what it felt like to be told you were not good enough. They had forgotten the desperation and the anger and the stubborn refusal to accept judgment that drives a species to transform itself. Humanity had not forgotten. Humanity remembered it like yesterday. You understand struggle in a way that we do not, the voice said. You understand failure. You understand the moment when everything seems hopeless and you keep going anyway. You understand how to take rejection and turn it into fuel. These are not weaknesses. These are the rarest and most valuable qualities in the galaxy, and we need them. Yuki looked at her crew. She saw tears on some faces, pride on others. She saw the communications officer, a young man from the orbital stations above Neptune, recording every word with hands that shook with the weight of what he was preserving. You want us to help other species survive their containment? She asked. We want you to help other species find what you found, not the technology, not the science, the will. The stubborn, irrational, magnificent refusal to accept defeat that seems to be uniquely human. We have studied 4,000 civilizations, and none of them possess it in the concentration and intensity that your species does. It is, if you will forgive the expression, your superpower. Yuki laughed. She could not help it. After 300 years of being called primitive, aggressive, unstable, and unworthy, humanity's defining characteristic, its stubbornness, its refusal to quit, its ability to get knocked down and get back up and keep going, was being called a superpower by the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. She thought about Elena Vasquez, about the smile she had given the alien ship above Saturn, about the words she had spoken. Being told you cannot do something has never stopped us before. She thought about every human who had ever been told they were not enough and had decided to be enough anyway. Every child who had struggled, every artist who had been rejected, every scientist whose theories had been laughed at, every ordinary person who had faced an ordinary day with extraordinary courage. This was what they had in common. This was the thread that ran through all of human history, from the first person who walked out of Africa to the last person who would ever draw breath. Humans do not quit. We accept, Yuki said. And with those two words, humanity's place in the galaxy changed forever. The years that followed were unlike anything the Concord had experienced. Humanity did not simply advise other species from a distance. Humans went to them, lived with them, learned their languages and their customs and their fears. And then, with a patience and empathy that startled even the oldest members of the Concord, they helped. They helped a species of aquatic beings on a water world near the galactic core who had been trapped in a cycle of tribal warfare for 2,000 years. Human diplomats spent decades living in underwater habitats, learning to breathe through artificial gills, earning the trust of factions that had not spoken to each other in centuries. Slowly, painfully, beautifully, the wars ended. They helped a hive-minded species on the far rim of the galaxy that had been so traumatized by the containment field that it had turned inward completely, sealing itself off from even its own solar system. Human psychologists, drawing on centuries of understanding human trauma, developed new therapeutic approaches for a consciousness that existed across millions of bodies simultaneously. It took a generation, but the hive opened up. It healed. It began to grow again. They helped a species of silicon-based beings that communicated through patterns of heat and light, and had been convinced by the containment that they were fundamentally broken. Human artists and engineers created translation tools that allowed the beings to share their experiences with other species for the first time. What emerged was a form of art so profound that it moved beings who had no eyes and no ears and no concept of beauty to something that could only be described as wonder. In every case, the approach was the same. Humans did not impose solutions. They did not lecture. They did not judge. They sat with the struggling species and said, in 1,000 different languages and 1,000 different ways, the same thing. We know what you are going through. We have been there. It gets better. You are more than what they say you are. You are more than what you believe you are. Keep going. And species after species, hearing those words from beings who had once been where they were, found the strength to keep going. The success rate of the containment program rose from less than 1% to 12% in a single century, then 20%, then 30%. Species that would have destroyed themselves were surviving. Civilizations that would have been lost were flourishing. The galaxy was becoming richer, more diverse, more alive, because of the work of a species that had been called primitive and excluded and locked away. But Concord was transformed, not just by the success of humanity's mentorship, but by humanity itself. Humans brought things to the galactic community that no other species had. They brought music that made crystalline beings resonate. They brought food that delighted species who had never encountered the concept of cooking. They brought stories, millions of stories, an endless river of narrative that the older species found absolutely intoxicating because their own cultures, stable for millions of years, had long ago run out of new things to say. And they brought something else. Something that no species in the Concord could name, but all of them could feel. An energy, a vitality, a refusal to accept that anything was impossible or permanent or beyond reach. It was infectious. Species that had been static for millennia began to change, to grow, to push their own boundaries in ways they had not done since their own youth. The galaxy was waking up, and humanity was the alarm clock. 500 years after the exclusion, the Concord held a ceremony. The ceremony was not for humanity. It was for the galaxy, a celebration of what had been achieved since a small, stubborn, improbable species on a small, stubborn, improbable planet had been told it was not welcome and had responded by becoming the most welcome species in the galaxy. The ceremony was attended by representatives of every member species, 5,000 of them now, thanks in large part to humanity's mentorship. They gathered in a vast construct built specifically for the occasion, a sphere of living light that floated between two stars and could be seen from 1,000 worlds. The human representative was a woman named Amara. She was born on Earth in a village in Nigeria where her grandmother still kept a garden and her grandfather still told stories by firelight. She was young for a diplomat, only 60, with a quick smile and a voice that carried across any room regardless of size or acoustics. She stood at the center of the sphere of light, surrounded by beings of every shape and size and composition imaginable, and she spoke. 500 years ago, you told us we were not ready. You were right. We were not. But you gave us something that day. Not the containment field, not the rejection. You gave us the truth. And the truth, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts, is the greatest gift one being can give another. We took that truth and we used it, not to become what you wanted us to be, to become what we wanted to be. And what we wanted to be, it turns out, was useful. We wanted to help. We wanted to lift others the way we wished someone had lifted us. We wanted to take the worst moment in our history and turn it into the best thing that ever happened, not just to us, but to every species struggling in the dark, wondering if they are good enough. She paused. She looked out at the gathered representatives of 5,000 worlds. You excluded Earth, and we smiled. And we walked away. And we came back with something you did not expect. We came back with hope, not just for ourselves, for everyone. That is what humans do. We take the things that break us and we turn them into the things that make us. And then we share them. Because that is what being part of a community means. You do not just take, you give. And what we give is the one thing the galaxy needed most and did not know it was missing. She smiled. That same smile. The one Elena Vasquez had smiled at the silver ship above Saturn. The one that had confused an alien intelligence and started a revolution. The one that said clearly and simply, you underestimated us. We give stubbornness, she said. We give refusal to quit. We give the crazy, beautiful, irrational belief that things can always get better. And they can. They always can. We are living proof. The sphere of light erupted. 5,000 species, in 5,000 different ways, expressed what could only be described as joy. And somewhere, in a small village in Nigeria, an old woman sat in her garden and looked up at the stars and smiled because her granddaughter was out there, speaking for a species that had been told it was nothing and had decided to be everything. The galaxy had excluded Earth. Humanity had smiled and walked away, and then it had walked back, carrying something so powerful, so simple, so profoundly human, but 4,000 ancient civilizations had no defense against it. Hope. Not the naive hope of a child, the earned hope of a species that had been through the fire and come out the other side, not unburned but unbroken. The hope that says, I know how bad it can get. I have seen the worst of what we are, and I still believe in the best of what we can become. The stars had never seemed so bright.